So, what exactly is a neocon? You've probably heard that word thrown around a lot, usually as an insult for a certain kind of Republican. But the real story, well, it's one of the most fascinating and, frankly, consequential journeys in all of American history. So, how did a group of anti Stalinist liberals become the architects of the Iraq War? Let's get into it. This right here, this is the quote that kind of started it all. It's from Irvin Kristol, who's known as the godfather of neoconservatism, and it just perfectly captures the whole idea of the movement, a huge and often pretty painful ideological transformation. These guys saw a reality of rising crime, social chaos, and what they believed were failing liberal policies, and it completely shattered their worldview. You gotta remember, these weren't people born into the conservative movement. They were converts. And that's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? How does a small circle of left-leaning intellectuals from New York City end up shaping the foreign policy of a Republican president and leading America into a war that would define the 21st century? That's the wild journey we're going on right now. All right, so let's rewind way back, because the starting point for this whole thing is probably not what you'd expect. It actually starts on the far left of the political spectrum, and understanding these surprising origins is absolutely key to understanding everything that came later. Okay, picture this. It's the 1930s, the student cafeteria at the City College of New York. In these little nooks they called the alcoves, you have this group of brilliant, mostly Jewish intellectuals, people like Irvin Kristol, and they're just arguing politics all day long. And here's the kicker. They were deeply anti-Stalinist, and a lot of them were even Trotskyists. Yeah, followers of that Trotsky, the exiled communist revolutionary. Their entire worldview was forged in fighting against totalitarianism, especially the Soviet brand. Now, just take a second and look at this. The ideological shift here is just massive. They started out as Democrats. They supported FDR's New Deal and the civil rights movement, but over the decades, they got really, really skeptical of big government social programs, especially stuff like Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, which they saw as, well-intentioned, but a total disaster in practice. It was a complete political migration. And it was all driven by this growing belief that liberalism had just gone soft, that it was too accommodating to what they saw as moral decay and the anti-American vibes of the counterculture. And look, this didn't happen overnight. It played out through key events and institutions. Journals like Commentary and The Public Interest, these became their intellectual homes, the places where they could really sharpen their critiques of modern liberalism. And then you get to 1968, a year that just brought all these simmering tensions to a roaring boil. Which brings us right back to Kristol's famous quote. The late 1960s, that was the mugging. That was the moment when the gap between their liberal ideals and the reality they were seeing on the streets just got too wide to ignore. It forced a dramatic, clean break with their political past. They looked around, they saw a city and a country in chaos, and they blamed the very liberal ideals they had once held dear. So what exactly pushed them over the edge? Well, it was like a perfect storm. They were absolutely disgusted by the counterculture. They saw the Democratic Party drifting into what they considered anti-Americanism. And as Jewish intellectuals, they were seriously alarmed by what they perceived as rising anti-Semitism coming from some Black Power activists and the radical New Left. And this one event, this teacher strike in New York, became a national symbol of this whole fight. On one side, you had the teachers union, a classic New Deal institution. On the other, you had New Left activists pushing for community control of schools. The future neocons, they sided with the union. They chose order, meritocracy, and established institutions over what they saw as radical, divisive identity politics. It was a line in the sand. So now they're politically homeless. They're way too conservative for the Democrats, but, with their immigrant roots and their lingering support for some parts of the welfare state, they were still a bit too liberal for many traditional Republicans. They were stuck in a political no man's land. They found a kind of temporary home with hawkish Democrats like Senator Scoop Jackson, who was just as anti-communist as they were. He was the bridge. And from there, it wasn't a long walk before they were advising the Reagan administration. Their journey into the heart of the conservative movement was complete. And they brought with them this new, muscular, interventionist foreign policy. But here's the thing. The old guard of the conservative movement was not rolling out the welcome mat. Not at all. They immediately clashed with the paleoconservatives, the traditional old right. Paleocons were typically nationalist, protectionist, and non-interventionist. And they were deeply suspicious of these former leftists from New York, seeing them as phonies, trying to hijack the soul of their movement. And this quote, wow, from historian Stephen Tonser, it just perfectly captures the pure hostility. I mean, he is not pulling any punches there. The old right saw the neocons as these Johnny-come-latelys with a sketchy past who were now trying to run the show. It was basically a civil war on the right, and frankly, you can still hear the echoes of that fight today. For about 2 decades, these ideas were simmering inside conservative think tanks and journals. But after the attacks of September 11th, 2001, neoconservatism suddenly moved from the pages of magazines to the very center of American power. It was about to get its ultimate test, and the world was never going to be the same. Yeah, 9/11 changed everything. It created this political climate of fear and urgency that just blew the doors wide open. Suddenly, decades of neoconservative thinking about American power and its moral purpose could be put directly into action. And now they had the power in the White House to actually do it. And this led directly to the Bush Doctrine, which was really the peak expression of their foreign policy ideas. So let's break it down. First, you have preemption. This was a radical idea. Instead of just containing threats, America could strike them before they fully materialized. Second, unilateralism. Basically, a rejection of the idea that we needed a permission slip from the UN or our allies to act. Third, military primacy. The goal was to make sure no other country could ever even dream of challenging American power. And fourth, the most ambitious one, actively spreading democracy by force if necessary. The 2003 invasion of Iraq was this doctrine in its purest form. It wasn't just about getting rid of a dictator. It was this grand, almost utopian project. They genuinely believed that by toppling Saddam Hussein, they could set off a chain reaction of democracy that would totally transform the entire region. The goal was a new Middle East, with a democratic Iraq shining as its beacon of hope. Well, as we all know, the war in Iraq did not go as planned, and in the very difficult, very bloody aftermath, the term neocon itself was transformed from an intellectual label into a straight-up political weapon. Yep, in the wake of the war, neocon stopped being a description of a specific intellectual movement and just became a political insult you could hurl at anyone you didn't like. For the left, it was a shorthand for warmongering imperialists. For the populist right, it was a way to attack the Republican establishment. The original meaning was almost completely lost. Today, that word has traveled a very long way from those cafeteria alcoves. For most people, it pretty much just means war hawk. But in some of the darker corners of the internet and political discourse, it's used as a coded anti-Semitic slur, where critics suggest the con is for conservative and the neo stands for Jew. A really bitter, ugly twist for a movement that was born from Jewish intellectuals. So that leaves us with this final question. Is the whole movement truly dead, just a failed project totally discredited by the war in Iraq? Or are its core ideas about American exceptionalism, about the moral necessity of American power, and the need to promote democracy still quietly influencing how Washington works, just waiting for another crisis to bring them roaring back to the forefront?